Hi, Alexei.
Hi,
How
Bob.
you doing?
I'm doing good, thank you. And you?
I'm doing okay. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV. You are Alexei Sidorenko. And this is an episode of Worldwise, and you are in another part of the world from me. You're actually in Poland, in
In Poland.
Warsaw.
Yeah.
But you also, in the past, you've spoken to us from Russia, and you think a lot
Yeah.
about Russia and work. Your work brings you in touch with Russian issues, and I think are you a Russian citizen as well?
Yes. Yes, of course. And I travel to Russia almost once in 2 months.
Uh-huh.
So I'm visiting Russia regularly.
Okay. And you are currently, I mean, you write about a lot of these issues involving communications technology in Russia, freedom of speech issues, and so on. But your position is director of Teplitsa Social Technologies.
Yeah.
Can you tell us?
Yeah.
Can you tell us what that is?
Well, this is an ICT4D project. We help Russian NGOs with IT. We educate. We publish a lot of educational materials. For example, how to use security tools, but also how to do pretty obvious things like online fundraising, crowdfunding, how to do crowdsourcing applications. We also develop stuff. We create websites for NGOs. We create software that assists non-governmental organizations in Russia, and we also run hackathons, meetups, webinars, and we produce screencasts. So in general, this is a pretty interesting educational project for civic initiatives and non-governmental organizations.
Okay. Now, the sense I've gotten from press coverage out of Russia is that there has been a clamping down on communications and on the media within Russia in recent years, and I think here in America, this Ukrainian issue is viewed kind of in that context, that we're seeing a very nationalist kind of Putin who's riding a wave of Russian nationalism, and that facilitates, I guess, kind of makes it easier for him to be more authoritarian than he used to be. And my sense is that in Russia, people have to be more careful about what they say than they used to be, but I'm not really sure about that. So I wanted to ask you, you have had these conversations with me from Russia in the past, and as I recall, you seem to feel fairly free to speak about issues of freedom in the press in Russia and to be critical of policies. And I'm just wondering, you're in Poland now, but if you were in Russia now, would you be more reluctant to speak about these things than you would have been 2 or 3 or 4 years ago?
Well, right now, I think not, simply because I'm doing it and I'm doing it for a long time, and I'd like to be consistent. I mean, there is because still you can still argue, you can still condemn what Russia is doing, and the Russian government and the Russian parliament passing new laws against the freedom of speech. You can criticize that, and the problem is, it's not that someone will persecute you for criticizing the new laws. Rather, the problem is that even among the liberal audience, the issue of freedom of speech online is still not very popular. There is a lot of apathy. There is even among the IT corporations, there is not much interest about it. And if we will see, for example, if we will compare the reaction to SOPA or PIPA in the United States and the laws that look actually the same, and we will see how the Russian IT companies reacted, there was significantly less response to the government pressure. And the other thing is that I'm both tweeting and writing mostly in English, because I think that it's equally important to tell the world about what is happening. So as long as you know, like write or publish in English, it doesn't create such a big, let's say, irritation among the government services as probably I would do this in Russian. Mm-hmm. So of course there's gonna be irritation, but I mean, like as long as you criticize, you know, issues that are not, you know, like very, let's say, that do not provide such, you know, vivid reaction. Like freedom of speech, and unfortunately, I should say that both the surveys show that, you know, like that there are a lot of people who actually do not care about the freedom of speech online, which is, for me, it's very short-sighted, let's say, behavioral pattern, because freedom of speech is important, and the situation we see now with the propaganda outrage and the ability of the propagandists to completely dominate the informational and discursive space in Russia is also the result that in Russian culture there was no, let's say, immunity developed to kind of create the, let's say, cultural mechanisms of free deliberation, free discussion, and this creates the thing that we can see Russia in the propagandistic situation, like media situation as it is now.
Okay, but am I correct in thinking that for people who are speaking in Russia, in Moscow, say, there is less freedom now than there was a few years ago?
Oh yes, absolutely, absolutely. There are like. Because there are right now there are much more laws that allow you to close the website, to block the website. There are much more ways for the government to actually prevent some information from spreading. And of course, I mean, like, information is better than water. It spreads where, like, you know, like, without, you know, you can't actually stop it very well, especially with the internet. But right now, like, if you take a look at all the news laws, including blacklist law and the so-called Russian SOPA and the new abilities that were passed in 2014 to block the websites by basically any like siloviki agency, any power or secret service agency, and also if you could see the precedents where, you know, like, fairly normal websites were blocked. Maybe they were unblocked later, but still, I mean, like, right now the danger of being blocked is much higher, and blocking is only one thing, and because we can see that there are simply less platforms for free discussion. There are much more paid organizations of bloggers and commenters who do this, and especially about Ukraine. And for example, even if we go further on, like to the things that are not completely related to the freedom of speech, like crowdfunding or online payments or online transactions, there was also another law that actually reduces greatly the ability of Russians to send each other money, because it was somehow not connected, but the Russian authorities connected the free flow of online money with the oppositional activities.
Yeah.
And I'm not. Yeah. So there are lots of let's say zones where Russians are less free.
Because I remember getting a sense in talking to you 2 or 3 years ago that although you know, television was fairly tightly controlled by the government, at that point the internet was not. It was just that there weren't that many people on the internet. I mean, the rate of penetration for the internet was not nearly as high in Russia as it was elsewhere. And so I remember thinking at the time, well, if the, you know, the amount of participation in the internet grows, connectivity grows in Russia, that should loosen things up. But it sounds like what has actually happened is that connectivity may have grown, but at the same time, the freedom on the internet itself has been very significantly diminished. And does it look to you like that is a sustainable thing? I mean, that the government can really prevent the internet from being a much freer place than the traditional media have been?
Well, I would say that Putin in general was a consequent enemy of freedom of expression, of freedom of basically anything. Mm-hmm. And it was just that the speeds of these new improvements were different. So, and you're absolutely right in your observations when you are saying that it's like while the internet was not such an important media, there was no, there was not much regulation there. Mm-hmm. But as soon as it gained in importance, and for example, in 2013, Yandex, actually the audience of Yandex was bigger than the audience of the first channel, the most popular TV channel, which is a big thing because, television was one of the actually pillars that of Putin's power, the control over television. Mm-hmm. But what we see later on that because people are not stupid, and as soon as people understand that they don't see the relevant information on the television, they're simply stop watching it, or at least watching it but do not use it as a source of the news. And we could see that internet had become an ever-increasing news source for Russians. And of course, especially after the post-election protests in 2011, 2012, and especially after Bolotnaya Square events and the protests, there was a number of, let's say, like targets mm-hmm. Of Putin after his inauguration and his third term. So one of them was urban protests, mm-hmm. Street protests, and the public assemblies and meetings. Then it was NGOs, and the foreign agents law was passed, which actually right now creates huge problems for non-governmental organization. And the third target was internet. So, and of course, it was also connected with the increasing popularity of internet and the role it actually, helped. Which played in helping organizing, new politicians, new political figures mm-hmm. that were actually prevented from getting into power by the, let's say, traditional mechanisms. And actually, Putin was successful in a way, trying to, create problems. He was not successful in actually blocking entirely the internet, mm-hmm. but he was actually successful in creating problems for the internet to develop, for the online society to develop, creating problems for IT companies also in Russia. Mm-hmm. And also with this idea of controlling the internet.
Okay.
And and people in there. So right now, whether you go, you will, like right now in 2014, as we can see it, whether you do or whether you go, and starting 1st of August, if you're a blogger with the popularity of over 3,000 readers, and no one knows who will be counting it, mm-hmm. You will also have to register. So there is another law, even if you write. And it was not the situation that was present before 2011. Even though still that the Kremlin, played some role. Mm-hmm. There were paid commenters, there were DDoS attacks, there were all kind of stuff, but they were they haven't been on this kind of a legal level. Mm-hmm. Right now, there is much more on the legal level, and right now, there are lots of stuff that actually can criminalize people who just do stuff on the net.
And can you talk a little bit about how some of this comes into play in the Ukraine issue? I mean, for example, you were talking about this issue of paid bloggers, where I guess the government was paying people kind of privately without it being known that these people were on the government payroll and expressing opinions in what seemed to be a kind of a genuine, authentic way, but in fact was in the service of the government. Is this happening? Do we know that this kind of thing is happening specifically in the context of the Ukrainian issue?
Well, we don't have, direct evidence that would connect those groups and those companies with the government agencies. Although, I mean, like everything directs it. I mean, like if it walks like a dog, looks like a dog, it's probably is a dog. And there was information, and there were recently an ever-increasing number of leaks that actually connect this huge amount of cyber warfare actors who are actively engaged in the Crimean and Ukrainian conflict that comment every day. And recently there was a fascinating article. It was an Excel spreadsheet with the most typical, let's say, phrases that you should use automatically for any kind of a argument or twist of a debate. There is a phrase.
You mean this was a spreadsheet that had been distributed to the paid commenters, or this was a spreadsheet
yes.
It was like a leaked spreadsheet.
Yes, that's a leaked spreadsheet, and there are all kinds of stuff. So, for example, like if not Putin, then who? And all these territories were all these cities were settled by Russian soldiers or the Russians in general, mm-hmm. or all kinds of stuff that start some kind of propagandistic mechanisms. Mm-hmm. That actually require you to engage in the debate, and because the commenters are paid either per comment or per day. Mm-hmm. The more people try to argue with these paid commenters, the more they actually get paid, and this, of course, creates big problems for the people who actually really want to persuade, to convince someone, and especially given that how much lie there was on the Russian media about the Ukrainian conflict and the Maidan in general. I mean, because there is a completely parallel structure of the let's say Ukrainian reality starting in November 2013. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that because internet, of course, helped to devaluate all these myths that the traditional media create, but the new thing that Putin's information warfare machine is doing is that they are also trying to create this parallel reality mm-hmm. Online, mm-hmm. and to let's say to reinforce the traditional media lies with the online lies. Mm-hmm.
Now, all that said, I assume that there was, even aside from the kind of a paid propaganda effort, there is a substantial amount of sentiment in Russia kind of in favor of the nationalist tenor of Putin's recent policies, including the sense that that Crimea is legitimately part of Russia and that possibly eastern Ukraine is as well. I mean, there is a considerable kind of core of support for that kind of thinking that's been around for some years, I gather, in Russia, right?
Well, I would say that I wouldn't call it nationalist. Mm-hmm. I would call it imperialist. Mm-hmm. And I think, yes, for a very weird but still very disappointing reason, a lot of Russians actually, and a lot of intelligent Russians actually support this imperialist motive. Mm-hmm. Yes, the popularity of these kind of Putin's movements was incredible. It was incredible, and at the same time increasingly sad because even on the personal level, I have few friends well, or probably I should say I had few friends who actually I mean, like until the Crimean or Ukrainian conflict, like they were, let's say moderate liberals, Democrats. They wouldn't support openly kind of some kind of liberal forces, but they were not pro-Putin as well, and like they didn't care much about politics. But I mean, like this kind of a thing about like rebuilding the empire suddenly became popular among them, and it's really impossible to talk to them right now because they actually, and also especially the Crimean incident, I mean, like people are ready to turn off their analytical skills just to buy the story, just to realize that it has even become a kind of a meme, like Krym nash, like Crimea is ours. And right now, I mean, like it's even like among the liberals there is we already call the people who are pro-imperialist, like Krym nash. Yeah, so like is this guy like Crimea is ours, like. No, he still haven't said anything like this. Okay, like then we can be calm about this person. But some people had completely changed within just few months, and it's really sad to see. These are very personal stories that people get let's say so. How would you say, they get so excited with such crazy things about the war and about the war against like really important neighbor, and they completely would believe in anything just to feel that Russia is big and powerful and everyone is afraid of Russia.
And how much is this driven by attitudes toward the West, toward Western Europe, toward the United States? And I mean, is there a perception of threat from the West, or a perception that Russia has been humiliated by the West? I mean, what do you think is driving this, what you call a kind of imperialist mindset?
Well, I think that I guess this is this kind of unclosed, unresolved trauma after Soviet Union collapse. I think in a way, I think there is. And also, like this is the result of consequent media control and consequent propaganda for many years, and also like for injecting all these kind of sentiments about rebuilding the empire. I mean, like it's like cancer in the terminal stage right now, in a way, that the propaganda and the imperialistic sentiment was present, but it was kind of slowly developing, and right now it has entered some kind of a stage that had reached the point of no return, in a way. Yeah. So, and speaking of the West, I mean, like usually if you would see the surveys earlier, I mean, like yes, there is of course there is kind of like 20% of the population that are like hardcore anti-Westerners, and even less sometimes. I mean, like they are just like really get their ideas back from the Soviet propaganda, and then there was like about 30% leaning a kind of like Western reluctant, but it still was a bit of half, maybe sometimes more than a half of the population who were like either actively or like passively they were not big fans of the West. But it's still like what Putin's propaganda is trying to show, that like Russia is entirely anti-Western. Well, this is not entirely true. This is only like partly true, because I mean, like there were a lot of people who like the West, who travel to Europe, who admire European culture, European consumption culture. I guess everyone, even anti-Westerners, actually, like in terms of consumption, they're like, oh my God, I mean, like they're very much pro-Western.
Right. But in terms of support for the policies, I mean, the numbers I've seen have been overwhelming. Like, I think it was after the Crimean thing that I saw poll numbers suggesting that like 90% of Russians supported what Putin had done. I mean, at the moment, I gather the support is pretty overwhelming.
Yeah, well, I mean, like here is the situation, because I mean, like we're in the situation when I mean, like there are almost no kind of an independent or like companies or organizations that can do independent surveys, and even Levada. That I guess they presented something like about 80% of support. Mm-hmm. And like they faced an accusation of being a foreign agent, which would mean closure to them.
Wow.
And like they're under big pressure, and they are the only organization left who is still kind of a more or less credible. And Tziom or FOM are already like not credible because they've lost their they lost their reputation. Like for so many times. I mean, like, and they would always show, numbers that are more comfortable for the government and for Putin than for, like for the truth. Yeah, or like more or less relevant to the what is actually is going on.
So even there's not even freedom of public opinion polling in a certain sense. I mean, if your findings are not approved by the government, then you may lose your license or whatever.
In a way, yes, and it's kind of a recent development. But I mean, like there were starting Putin's reign, it was ever increasing. But for example, the foreign agents things for Levada, this is a completely new thing, and still, of course, Lev Gudkov is still, I think Lev Gudkov, yeah. So he's still quite critical, but I mean, like in terms of what they present, well, I can't say that I'm absolutely sure. Can be absolutely sure that these numbers are right, but still, even though they might be higher, and like still the general numbers actually show the situation. Mm-hmm. They actually show that yes, this may be true. There are a lot of people who suddenly had become huge Putin supporters.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any sense for how the control of information is working out in eastern Ukraine? I mean, I gather that first of all, there's kind of a battle over which TV stations are broadcast. I mean, Russia wants its TV stations to broadcast, the Russian language stations to keep broadcasting in eastern Ukraine, but does not want some of those that are, I guess, Ukrainian language or reflecting the view in Kiev to keep broadcasting right. And then also there's the question of what's going on in the internet as well. And I assume there's maybe some tension over that. Do you have a sense for what's going on in eastern Ukraine in terms of information and information technology?
Well, unfortunately, I think I don't know because I'm not such a big expert on Ukraine. I've heard that, I mean, like what I know for sure that, I mean, like for a long time before the conflict, it was the area where most of the population would watch Russian TV and Russian TV channels. Mm-hmm. What I've heard recently, and I can't be sure about this, is that Ukrainian government actually disallowed the transmissions of the Russian TV channels there, and for obvious reasons, because I mean, like the amount of lies on the Russian media was enormous, and it was directly, indirectly influenced the situation and the bloody situation which is now. And I believe that the Russian journalists are personally responsible for the bloodshed that is happening right now in the southeastern Ukraine. But I can't say for sure what is going on. I think that unlike Russia, there are no blocking laws, and at least the online flow of information is much freer in Ukraine, even though in the occupied territories. But still, I don't even know what is the level of connectivity right now in the areas of conflict. Which is still, it's a separate problem. So,
yeah, it may not be very high. Is your sense that there's enough support for an aggressive policy in Ukraine right now that it would be a problem for Putin if Eastern Ukraine did not, in some sense, come under greater Russian influence? In other words, if Ukraine remains intact, aside from Crimea, of course, but if Ukraine remains intact otherwise, and all of it, becomes part of the European Union, for example, and so in the end, there's no successful separatist movement in the East, and it's a reasonably unified Ukraine. Would that be like a political problem for Putin now that the public opinion is so worked up over this?
Well, I think personally, I don't think that let's say the entry to the European Union is possible in the nearest perspective. Even though I definitely wish Ukrainians would be part of the European Union. But obviously the unification of Ukraine, which actually I think I would agree with those observers who say that it actually happened with the presidential elections, because even if you take a look at the electoral maps, there you can't see this traditional pattern of East-West. You will see like completely new pattern that haven't existed before, and this is an absolutely new thing, and I think that this is definitely the reason for Putin to be worried, and really worried. And
so wait, let me be clear on what you're saying. So in significant parts of eastern Ukraine, there was no voting because rebels controlled the territory.
It was not. In terms of population, yes, there was no voting in Crimea. There was no voting in part of Lugansk and in part of Donetsk regions, but only in parts. There are still territories where elections took place. But even though territories that are not in the areas of conflict, usually these kind of blue regions of Odessa, Nikolaev, Kherson, Dnipropetrovsk, and all these regions would be represented by the president, by the candidate from the east. And right now, there was no such thing. Maybe because also there was kind of I guess in a way that it wasn't entirely fashionable to vote someone from the east while there was such a huge separatist movement. But still, it's still part of the situation, and this is what happened.
Let me just be clear. So you're saying that to the extent that there was voting in the east, it wasn't along it didn't fit the typical pattern of just kind of pro-Russian voting in the East. There was substantial voting for the candidate, the pro-unity candidate who did win.
Exactly, and I think this is a big problem for Russia now, because those territories where the separatist movement were not inspired, or Russia didn't have time to create something like they did in Donetsk or Lugansk. Everywhere the same, there is a very at least how I feel it, how I observe it, is that there is a reaction, this is a shock reaction. And as a shock reaction, I think that there is a much more kind of pro-unification agenda right now. and even in the traditionally Russian language regions, people see what is happening, and they would rather stay in Ukraine than they would stay in any kind of a quasi-state created on the border instead.
Okay. All right. Well, this is all very interesting. Now, before we sign off, is there anything else we should know about what's going on with freedom of expression or relatedly with communications technology, either in Russia broadly or in Eastern Ukraine, or in Russia with respect to Eastern Ukraine? Are there things we have failed to talk about that are relevant?
I would definitely observe the situation with the bloggers law that will be effective starting August 1st, because it doesn't also require the special conditions for bloggers, but it also requires special conditions for everyone who is signed as operators of internet, of massive information, and which is actually basically any social network. And so any operator of mass digital information would be obliged to provide the Russian government almost entire information about its users, about login times, about nicknames, about IP addresses, like everything. And it's going to be effective in a few months. And I think the situation that we will face is that either, and I hope I'm wrong, but like so far, I mean, like haven't seen where it's going for for a few years. Like I wouldn't be surprised if the Russian government would do this. Is that we can see that either there's going to be social networks that will actually give up the users' data, and this would mean like huge problems for activists, or they would be closed. And I mean, like this would mean problems both for activists and as well as for anyone else. So I mean, like this is a really, really frightening scenario of complete online isolation, and actually the fragmentation and actually Russia being cut out of the global net.
And this is definitely going to happen on August 1st?
Well, so far the law is being effective, and it's definitely happening. What these and as for these requirements for the operators, so far there is a tricky situation, because they are now marked as the acts under the law. So the parliament didn't pass them through, and they are still kind of like in the drafts. So, but if they become actual documents under the law that would actually tell how the law should be obeyed and should be not realized, but should be performed. So if they become published and become official, then yes, that would mean huge problems.
Okay, and do you imagine that if the law does come into effect, that there would be a sufficiently strong reaction against it to create a problem for Russian authorities, or is there just not enough kind of activist, defiant energy for that to happen?
Well, I mean, like this is the thing that I mean, like there were restrictive laws against the internet like throughout the last 3 years, and none of them created any significant reaction. And this is what I'm incredibly sad about. And the reason is that, for example, there on one hand there are kind of like freedom of speech activists who are who know how to circumvent all these blockings, but they are still they're still they would rather circumvent than protest.
Right.
So they don't see the big picture.
But this new law would make it harder for them to just so easily circumvent the things, right?
Yes, yes, and I mean, like, because there is still, as I said in the beginning, there is still the problem, not even on the level of the blockings, but rather of how people see the big picture, and this is a problem of like global, kind of civic education, of actually explaining that, come on, guys, if you don't care about the freedom of speech, tomorrow you might get into the trouble that, like, you will just get into the situation where you can't, exit it because you've lost your battle even without knowing it. Before, like, few days before, you just, like, ignored something really important what was happening.
Okay. Well, then we'll stay tuned both to the Ukraine developments, but also to these issues in Russia itself as August 1st approaches. So thank you so much for taking the time, Alexei.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for asking all those important questions.
Okay, and best of luck with your work.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. The same to you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.